It would be hard for me to overstate my delight and gratitude at the opportunity to offer this year's TV Maston Lecture in Christian Ethics at Logsdon Seminary. Dr. Maston had long retired by the time I was a student at Southwestern Seminary, but he was still an active presence on the campus, and his books were required reading in my course of study. His Why Live the Christian Life was a major factor in my decision to do doctoral work in the field of Christian ethics, and his Biblical Ethics, I see several volumes on the front pew here, was a challenge to me to ground my efforts in a faith constantly nurtured by engagement with Scripture. My thanks to Drs. Williford and Dr. Lawrence and to all who've made this occasion possible for the invitation. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here. I would like to begin with a brief reflection on Scripture. Most of us have some familiarity with the book of Job and its story of a man in crisis. We know of Job's losses and the failure of his friends to provide either insight or comfort. We recall the overwhelming voice from the whirlwind, and we recall Job's humble response, as well as the final restoration of Job's honor at the conclusion of the book. A passage from the book, however, that often goes unnoticed is the remarkable reflection found in Job chapter 28, which begins with an assessment of human capabilities to gain control over the material world in ways that bring benefit to humanity. Such capacities display power and result in profit. These amazing achievements, the employment of certain engineering technologies to draw riches from the earth, distinguish us from other very impressive creatures. The path no bird of prey knows, nor has the falcon's eye caught sight of it. The proud beasts have not trodden it, nor has the fierce lion passed over it. Then there is man. He puts his hand on the flint. He overturns the mountains at the base. He hews out channels through the rocks, and his eye sees anything precious. He dams up the streams from flowing, and what is hidden he brings out to light. In the midst of a lengthy exploration of the mysteries of life and the elusive ways of God, the book of Job marvels at human capacities to use the technologies at hand in the ancient world to display a measure of mastery over creation that distinguishes us from other creatures and results in our benefit. That's the outlook offered in Job chapter 28, the first 11 verses. In those first 11 verses, there's no hint of reservation, nothing but the atmosphere of accomplishment and approval of technological assertiveness. But then, suddenly, there follow two questions. But where can wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? It is as if reflection on human capabilities to gain mastery and advantage from the raw stuff of the world begs important questions. Do all these impressive accomplishments really amount to much when you've lost your children? Does our technological superiority over birds and beasts really matter in the face of bewilderment and tragedy? How can we tell what really matters? Where can wisdom be found? After the questions of verse 12, there follows a survey of several false paths towards this elusive wisdom. Man does not know its value, nor is it in the land of the living. The deep says, it's not in me. It's not with me, the sea says. Pure gold cannot be given in exchange for it, nor can silver be weighed at its price. Eventually we come to this insistence regarding a wisdom that might inform our efforts at discerning what matters. Abaddon and death say, in verse 22, with our ears we have heard a report of it. The offer is not a confident one, but the suggestion is that if we even want to get close to this wisdom, recognition of our limits and frailties as mortal creatures has to somehow play a role. Now, if we bring Job the sage into our contemporary context, his questions remain provocative. Our technologies reveal much about ourselves and our world. Marveling at such technologies, though, is not the same as the wisdom needed for grasping their proper role in our lives. Recognizing our limits as creatures, owning up to the reality of our mortality, perhaps puts us on the path toward the wisdom we need to recognize the proper use and thus any proper limits to our use of technology. What, though, if such limits themselves become the target of technological control? What if technology sets its sights on erasing all vestiges of human limitation, even to the point of slaying death itself? That dragon tyrant lurking at the border that marks life's final horizon. Maybe it sounds a little too sci-fi to entertain the notion that we will, through our advancing technologies, discover the holy grail of eternal life on our own terms without the inconvenience of suffering and death. But that is precisely the agenda of what goes by the name posthumanism. The time is fulfilled, and the singularity is at hand. That techno-apocalyptic moment when human consciousness can leave behind its limited, frail, and mortal embodied condition and seize control of personal evolution so as to experience any virtual reality imaginable. What we may be in this post-human era will be up for grabs. It is difficult for us to imagine what it would be like to be a post-human person, says Oxford philosopher Nick Bostrom. What is evident, though, among post-humanists is the quest for limitless intellectual power, indefinite youth and vitality, and absolute control over emotions and consciousness, goals theoretically available through increasingly sophisticated and powerful bio and computer technologies. In the meantime, transhumanists will take advantage of the accelerating pace of technological development and scientific understanding radically to improve the human condition and to lengthen its durability to the point where a person could, in some way, survive to see the arrival of the post-human era. The ultimate prize is the transformation of humans from our present, frail, risky, and mortal condition into something beyond the reach of limitation and death. Now, one response to the post-human agenda is that its adherents have obviously watched way too much Star Trek, and while that might certainly be the case, what is called the Humanity Plus or H Plus vision of a cybernetic future for humanity professes simply to extrapolate from the accelerating rate of technological innovation and argue that by the midpoint of the 21st century, we will have already seen fundamental changes in the human condition toward its post-human destiny. Such claims demand scrutiny, and for Christians, the agenda calls for evaluation in light of basic convictions concerning human nature. We must ask what fundamental assumptions sustain and drive the H plus outlook. I want first, though, to spend a few moments detailing some of the challenges we face in any discussion of posthumanism. Some of the challenges we face in discussing the H plus outlook are those that pertain to any discussion of the relationship between humanity and technology. One of the most significant hurdles we face in any such consideration is that we reflect on and evaluate technologies with minds that have already largely been shaped and informed in a world defined by technology. We are immersed deep within what Albert Borgman calls the device paradigm. The very pattern by which we view and interpret our daily lives is formed by technology. We live within what Neil Postman calls a technopoly, not simply a state of culture, but a state of mind in which we believe that technical progress is humanity's supreme achievement and the instrument by which our most profound dilemmas are solved. The late Canadian philosopher George Grant explores the neologism technology, a word that only came into prominent use beginning in the 1930s that brings together techne, artifice, device, handiwork, and logos, reason. Grant argues that our thinking and our doing are now so intertwined that our way of knowing the world achieves any critical distance from our efforts at mastering the world only with great difficulty. The vita contemplativa, the contemplative life, has been thoroughly subsumed under and superintended by the vita activa, the active life, so that our reflection on the world is determined already by a world framed by technology. And so, where can wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? It will be hard to find any such place where technology has not preceded us. Another challenge we face in attempting any critical evaluation of our technologically oriented aspirations is that the achievements of technology are so universally embraced and hailed as unmixed blessing that to raise any questions about such runs the risk of fierce criticism and accusations of ingratitude. H+ voices label any who question post-human ambitions as bio-Luddites or bioconservatives. To suggest any limits to technological innovation, post-humanists insist, is to prefer the Dark Ages to the modern world and is blindly to ignore the benefits technology has so far produced and that offers an even brighter future. At this point, let me clarify a couple of matters. Many features of technological innovation we can and should gratefully accept. My wife went through hip replacement surgery last summer, and my sweet little cyborg is just doing fine, and she has a mobility that she has not enjoyed for years. We need to understand, though, a fundamental distinction between past approaches to technology and where things stand in a postmodern context. Let me put it this way. We have long used technologies as means by which we extend human capacities beyond our natural limitations. Post-human technologies would be means by which we transform human being itself without regard to natural limitations, seeking the elimination of such altogether. Let's understand what posthumanists seek. They seek to transform human existence to such an extent that it no longer makes sense to speak of being human at all. They do not seek to improve human existence, but to replace it. They desire what C.S. Lewis called the abolition of man. With such stakes in mind, accusations of ingratitude aside, I think we need to raise some questions. I want to mention one more challenge we specifically face as Christians in any effort to evaluate post-humanist recourse to technology to provide technological redemption and deliverance of the human condition. And I use those terms deliberately to indicate that there is a quasi-religious character to the H+ agenda. Historian David Noble cautions that the religion of technology has become our common enchantment, and that the expectations of ultimate salvation through technology has become the unspoken orthodoxy of our day. So much is this the case, Noble says, that pleas for some rationality, for reflection about pace and purpose, for sober assessments of cost and benefits are dismissed as irrational. It is the case, though, that our religion of technology did not spring up overnight. And because of a lengthy history of entwinement, from the monastic origins of the clock to holographic transmissions of distant pastors to remote satellite worship centers, it seems natural for us to accept the gradual displacement of a grace that is mysterious and not at our disposal, with what obviously works under our more direct management. My point is that Christian critique of the H+ agenda will have to admit to our own eager and sometimes uncritical reliance on technology, and that evaluation of posthumanist technologies might expose our own religious syncretism, and that can be an uncomfortable experience. The challenges for substantive Christian critique of the posthumanist agenda are significant. We best engage in that critique by examining the main and commonly held assumptions that undergird and sustain the H+ outlook. These assumptions have chiefly to do with basic perspectives concerning human nature. Before we do that, let me briefly outline more distinctly some of the explicit hopes and expectations embraced within various expressions of the H+ movement. The common concern among H+ aspirants is the abolition of any constraints and limits that presently define the human condition. These constraints include any physical limitations due to our embodied condition, relative physical weakness, vulnerability to sickness and disease, and especially our destiny with death. Other constraints would include limited mental capabilities, failing memories, our susceptibility to mental disorder, or any type of what is sometimes called unchosen psychology. The general assessment of our present human condition is that as embodied beings, we face intolerable constraint of an infinite will that is unduly limited by our fragile and mortal condition. The greatest obstacle and threat to this will, of course, is the threat of death. The H+ agenda sees death as its primary enemy and offers a variety of proposals for its defeat. First is the quest for biological immortality. Natural selection has shown its incompetence in providing us with such frail and vulnerable shells to house our infinite and ever-grasping will. If the DNA of Adwaita, an Aldabra giant tortoise who died in 2006 at the age of 255, if the DNA of Adwaita could provide that creature such a lengthy existence, could we not modify our own DNA toward such radical life extension? The new, and this stuff is remarkable, the new gene editing technique known as CRISPR-Cas9 provides a powerful and low-cost tool that offers hope for ridding the human race of inheritable and debilitating diseases. You'll be hearing more and more about CRISPR-Cas9. Could gene editing make up for the deficiencies of natural selection and adjust our DNA to increase dramatically the average lifespan, perhaps to indefinite proportions? In his recently published Posthumanism, A Guide for the Perplexed, Peter Mahan warns, CRISPR seems to be taking humanity into the uncharted and unsettling territory of genetic posthumanism, whether we like it or not. Biological immortality, though, would still have its hazards. After all, accidents happen, and wounds and injuries could overtake us where disease and aging might not. Another option would be some form of cybernetic immortality, whereby our physical vulnerabilities as flesh and blood would be offset by artificial components of the sort that come with warranties. Brent Waters, who's written extensively on these matters, describes the possibilities. Synthetic blood vessels and skin will replace the less durable natural components, and as muscles deteriorate, arms and legs will be assisted or replaced with sophisticated prosthetics. Nanobots will be injected to surgically repair or replace diseased organs, and neuroenhancers inserted into the brain to prevent the deterioration of memory and other cognitive functions. While an upgrade from the vulnerabilities of biological immortality, cybernetic immortality still carries risks. Parts wear out, They can be replaced, but a hybrid or cyborg remains vulnerable to accidents or malicious acts resulting in death. So, Waters maintains, although a predominantly artificial body is an improvement, it is still not an ideal solution in overcoming the limits of embodiment. The most exotic and esoteric expression of posthumanism, then, is one that leaves the constraints and vulnerabilities of immortality entirely behind: virtual immortality, by which the essential self of the mind is uploaded into an environment made suitable through developments in artificial intelligence. It is this last prospect, the uploadable mind, that occasions the most skepticism, as it begs affirmative answers to the most debated questions. Is human consciousness reducible to a digital format? Is the mind essentially software? Are the operations of a living, working brain reproducible in a non-organic environment? How these questions are related to one another and how they might even be independently answered are fiercely debated. In any case, what transhumanism hopes and what posthumanism assumes is that the essentials of personal identity can be scanned using advanced magnetic resonance imaging techniques and all its salient details reinstated into a suitably powerful computer substrate, capturing a person's entire personality, memory, skills, and history. Now, sticklers wonder what counts for salient details, but the question of whether such an uploaded mind would fully correspond to the current embodied mind is somewhat irrelevant for the true posthumanist, since the self at any moment is an artificial construct to begin with. And besides, such indeterminacy is part of what puts post into posthumanism. Now, some of the underlying assumptions of the H+ agenda have already been implied in this overview of its different manifestations. I want, though, to make explicit some of those assumptions so as to make way for a clear contrast between posthumanist aspirations and what represents a more traditional Christian outlook. As we dig beneath the H+ agenda to uncover its underlying assumptions, let me offer a preemptive strike to one possible challenge to the concerns I want to raise. Is this topic not so fanciful that any time in analysis and critique would be better spent on more pressing matters? Why indulge the fantasies of science fiction? Well, while many of the goals of posthumanism might seem far-fetched, aspirants point to, first, the already remarkable achievements of biotechnology, robotics, information technology, and nanotechnology, as well as, second, the ongoing acceleration of such technological advancements, the pace of which will only proceed, some insist, at an exponential rate. To make his point about the pace at which technological innovations proceed, Ray Kurzweil cites a quaint prediction from a 1949 volume of Popular Mechanics, where a calculator of the ENIAC is equipped with 18,000 vacuum tubes and weighs 30 tons. Computers in the future may have only 1,000 vacuum tubes and perhaps weigh 1.5 tons. Well, some of you are wearing digital watches right now that have far greater computational capacity than did those computers of the 40s. Given the quickened pace of computational performance, Kurzweil projects that personal computers will match human brain capacity within the next few years, maybe 2030, maybe 2040. While computational performance alone does not guarantee the promise of a posthumanist future, advances in information technology, Kurzweil argues, will support the acceleration of innovations in other areas, genetics, nanotechnology, robotics, that will result in interplay and myriad synergies as a consequence of multiple intertwined technological advances. Given sufficient artificial intelligence, Kurzweil insists, the other required posthumanist technologies will certainly follow. At the same time, though, The far-fetched character of sci-fi is really beside the point. Science fiction literature is not simply juvenile escapist fantasy, at least not quality science fiction literature. Rather, such works as by Jules Verne or H.G. Wells, Isaac Asimov, or Arthur C. Clarke, they have always been concerned to integrate substantive science and the technological imagination to communicate human hopes for the future, revealing discontent with the present, or human fears of the future, revealing discontent with ourselves. Depictions of an alternative reality provide significant means by which we express what we think about this one, and what we believe is genuinely important. So, whether the technological developments projected in the posthumanist vision ever take place, it would be a mistake simply to dismiss the H+ agenda as geek testosterone on a jump drive. As Brent Waters explains, posthuman discourse is predominantly a hyperbolic description and apology of our present circumstance. Portraying a titillating and tantalizing future is to add a rhetorical flourish to what we have already become. What we have already become, what we already think about ourselves, and what we presently believe is important become more apparent as we uncover basic assumptions driving the H+ outlook. We have time to distinguish 4 fundamental and interrelated assumptions that reside at the core of the posthumanist perspective and which, at the same time, reflect prevailing features of our contemporary cultural landscape. First is the insistence that the very concept of human nature as something given and fixed has been overthrown as arbitrary, socially constructed, and most often a tool of oppression. Instead, whatever it means to be human is strictly a personal project under perpetual revision, malleable and mutable, and thus readily subject to technological modification. If you have any questions as to the significance of this perspective, just ask Caitlin Jenner. Coupled with this view of the amorphous and pliable character of the human is the insistence that there exist no clear boundaries between the human and the non-human. The running thread through Peter Mahan's recent posthumanism is his concern to deny such distinctions. Having surveyed the latest developments in cybernetics, neuroprosthetics, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence, Mahan concludes that we need not wait to achieve the uploadable consciousness to know that the lines that separate the human from the non-human are porous, and that all those branches of technoscience already actively challenge the hard and fast distinction between human and non-human. One consequence of this perspective is that to those who resist the H+ agenda out of a concern for human dignity, the simple response is that the very concept itself is a doubtful one. A third assumption operating within posthumanist aspirations and a corollary of those first two is the dismissal of a telos. That's the Greek word for goal or purpose. The dismissal of a telos for human existence. While the particulars have differed from time to time, there used to be the sense that there was a telos, a purpose to human existence. For Aristotle, it is the life of contemplation. For the Apostle Paul, it is conformity to Christ. Thomas Aquinas echoed Aristotle, but specified the contemplation of God. The Westminster Confession calls humanity to the end of glorifying and enjoying God forever. If there is no such thing as human nature, though, there clearly cannot be some defined purpose attached to the ever-shifting, ever-plastic, ever-modulating modern self. And if there is no difference between the human and the non-human, the scientific dismissal of any final purpose for rocks or Rottweilers applies to us as well. The H plus movement has no specified goal, no particular aspiration other than one defined negatively: the avoidance of what it does not like. Any limitation on the infinite demands of the autonomous will. The sovereignty of the autonomous will is the fourth assumption driving the posthumanist agenda. And here we might journey from Descartes' "I think, therefore I am," through Nietzsche's assertive will to power, to Scarlett Johansson's Ghost in the Shell, to a firm, a disembodied, and thus transferable, not thinking thing, but willing thing. If there is any essential feature to our existence that can and must be released from its internment in our mortal bodies, it is the autonomous and infinite will. To choose without limit, without constraint, beyond the confines of biology or any imposed telos, is the singular good of the H plus agenda. So, as the late Jean Elshtain observed, characteristic of all projects of self-sovereignty is a triumph over something, nature being one of the chosen antagonists. In a world that suffers the eclipse of divine sovereignty, self-sovereignty moves to eclipse the world and pursues its own transcendence in the quest for, as Elshtain puts it, mastery, control, domination, triumph over nature, including our own natures. Elshtain traces the impact of this notion of the sovereign self and its dreams of radical transcendence through the modern eugenics movement and its current expressions in abortion and in the quest for positive genetic enhancement. The ultimate expression of this Gnostic depreciation of our embodiment, though, appears in the posthumanist ideal of the free and incorporeal will, writing for itself whatever reality it might at the moment prefer, existing only as the digitalized, autonomous self. The posthuman vision of an arbitrary self unconstrained by the boundaries of nature because it is totally immersed in boundless nature is but a technological innovation away from realization. This innovation, however, is not so much that of some advance in genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, so on and so forth. It is more of a new role for technology that no longer functions as a tool used by humans, but now as an agent, a determinant possessing the capacity to constitute human experience. It is no longer a question of asking how humanity will employ advanced technologies. Rather, the question is, according to Elaine Graham, to what extent is technology reshaping our experiences and understandings of what it means to be human? In a Cartesian world of sovereign mind over matter, technology simply provides tools, devices, and procedures to assist human living. But in a world where mind and matter, humanity and nature, the real and the constructed, have all merged, technologies are more than mere appendages to autonomous human reason. They actually affect our experiences and apprehensions of what it means to be human, so that we cannot conceive of ourselves independent of our tools and technologies. Already, a post-human sensibility operates, certainly in any context where technology is no longer other, but has been fully assimilated into our everyday human functioning. Whether the talk is of prosthetics, cochlear implants, heart pacemakers, laptops, tablets, iPhones, the internet, gene editing, assisted reproduction, biological humans are everywhere surrounded and transformed into mixtures of machine and organism. In this environment, what we call nature has already been significantly reshaped by technology, and technology in turn has become assimilated into nature as a fully functioning component of organic life itself. It's about this time I'd like for you to turn to your neighbor and give them a hug, just to make sure that there's still this kind of human contact there, all right? Was that good for you? Posthumanists eagerly anticipate those technological advances that promise increased longevity, heightened intelligence, direct human-computer interface, and eventually the grail of an uploadable consciousness into a virtual reality where perceptions of time and space are entirely programmable. That anticipation is fostered and sustained, however, by a disposition that no longer simply seeks ease from suffering and expansion of human choices, but sees formal notions of human being as arbitrary and knows no reason why such choices cannot include new combinations of the relationship between the organic and the non-organic, even if such combinations are not recognizably human. While such combinations are not yet entirely possible, culturally, the Man-chine has already arrived. Perhaps H+ aspirations are nothing but the visions of an adolescent male sense of invulnerability, seeking license for perpetual self-indulgence, and all this dressed up in the language of technological innovation. We should recognize, though, that in some ways the post-humanist agenda shares many points of correspondence with the Christian faith. Brent Waters has identified several key areas of agreement between posthumanism and Christian theology. Posthumanists and Christians agree that the current state of the human condition is less than ideal. Both agree that it is important to seek release from this condition. Both Christians and posthumanists see death as the final enemy, and both place their hope in a future that lies beyond the reach of human mortality. If there are similarities, however, it is because posthumanism represents a current expression of what John Milbank has traced throughout the history and aspirations of modernity. While Nick Bostrom and others would assert the secular character of transhumanism and posthumanism, Milbank insists that what we call the secular does not just borrow inherently inappropriate modes of expression from religion as the only discourse to hand, but is actually constituted in its secularity by heresy in relation to orthodoxy, or else a rejection of Christianity that is more neo-pagan than simply anti-religious. The technologies feeding posthumanist aspirations might be very this-worldly. Their true inspiration, however, lies elsewhere, in an enduring otherworldly quest for transcendence and salvation. Noreen Hertzfeldt, who's written extensively on artificial intelligence, summarizes the paired sense of self and salvation maintained by posthumanism. When one becomes pure data, one can transform oneself at will, becoming nearly anything at any time, transcending all limitations. Virtual immortality offers limitless choice in limitless time and space. It promises the unencumbered self, the realization of the serpent's offer of a shedding of the constraints of creatureliness for divine-like existence beyond the boundaries of history and embodiment. As Hertzfeldt observes, the H+ vision of virtual immortality in cyberspace assumes perspectives on human nature and the character of eternal life that are quite different from those of most Christians. In light of such a contrast, Job's questions, where can wisdom be found, and where is the place of understanding, become all the more significant. What resources Christians might have available in response to the rise of the Man-chine is a vital matter for us to consider, and one I hope we'll be able to pursue in the morning. Thank you. Dr. Wilford.
Dr. Holloway has consented to take a few questions here at the end, but I would ask, because we are taping this presentation, that you come near the front make sure that the question is very clear, and if you would repeat the question, that way it gets into the soundtrack.
Anything on anybody's mind on these kinds of matters? Yes, sir. Tell me your name, please. You know, it really is becoming more and more pervasive. I just kind of mentioned in passing this new movie that's coming out with Scarlett Johansson. But a few years ago, there was Johnny Depp, Transcendence. Anybody see that one? It's an interesting movie. Interesting. Of course, the Matrix series of films was very much along these lines of our minds being thoroughly maintained and our sense of reality being maintained in a digital format. One of the most interesting, I mentioned in Elaine Graham, she has a book, Representations of the Posthuman, and she has a whole chapter on Star Trek. And over the years, from the early episodes in the 1960s to the more recent iterations, there's been quite a journey in the attitudes concerning artificial life. There was data in the 1980s and 90s on the Enterprise there. And if anybody ever watched Voyager, there was a holographic character in that series, entirely artificial, but we were led to believe that he was fully human being, just as much as anybody else on the crew. He even managed somehow to have children. I don't know how that was possible, but holographic projection having children. So, I mean, it is an ongoing kind of feature. My wife has been living with me for quite some time on this issue, and we were viewing some film the other day. She said, well, that's that posthumanism stuff, isn't it? I said, yeah, it really is everywhere. Whether it's explicit, though, or not, I think that those four features of there being no real fixed or given sense of what it means to be a human, no boundaries between human and non-human, no sense of telos and the sovereignty of the autonomous will. I think those, whether they show up in science fiction literature or not, I think those are pervasive features of our culture. Other matters. Yes, sir? I think that, well, okay, he's wondering how, in the arena of posthumanism, objective-oriented ontology would figure. I think that's entirely out the window. I think that's hegemony, that's totalitarianism, that's oppressive. As is any metaphysic, they would say. Of course, they offer their own metaphysics. Thank you. I love ontology stuff. Most folks don't. Ron? Rod has asked this question of how in Baptist life we can teach folks who have sometimes a very narrow understanding of spirituality as soul stuff and not body stuff. And to that degree, I kind of think that there are some aspects of contemporary Christianity that have served to foster some of the attitudes that go into the posthumanist outlook. There is actually, believe it or not, a Christian transhumanist society. And so I think that they have themselves kind of dismissed this vital feature of embodiment. You know, to me, it sure seems to be so clear in what the Apostle Paul has to say when he writes to the Romans and says, present your bodies a living sacrifice. But we do have to flesh that out. And we have to flesh it out with what we do with our mouths as we speak to one another with words of encouragement, not unfruitful words. What we do with our hands. Paul says, work with your hands what is good so that you may have something to give to the one who is in need. Paul is all about body talk. And when we observe the Lord's Supper and we hear those words, this is my body, it's not something we have given sufficient attention to, but it is pervasive in the New Testament. And here's the big deal. The New Testament says that our Christian hope is not of disembodied souls flitting about heaven. It is of the resurrection. I learned my earliest theology, like many of us did, watching Saturday morning cartoons. And I remember seeing, maybe it was Elmer Fudd, who'd get killed in something, and this translucent Elmer Fudd would sprout wings and grab a harp and ascend to a cloud. And that's kind of what we thought of as heaven. It is the empty tomb that is the first fruit of our destiny. And while that raises lots more questions than we'd have time for this evening, that has to be a focal point of what we need to... That explains why what we do with our bodies now does indeed matter. That they are the arena through which God is active and present in the world. Are there any other matters? Yes, sir. Tell me your name. Evan.
It's really easy to see the difficulty in this embodiment and the way that we portray it. But it kind of seems like when it comes to our physical expansion, Jews have really been overcoming our physical limits in history.
Sure. Right.
And now it's just becoming a part of augmenting our own bodies instead of what our bodies are capable of doing with tools. So in a world that has things like organ transplants and bionic prosthetics,
Right.
replace it with like artificial hands that can actually move.
Right.
Is there any specific danger to these bodily augments in this?
Well, like I said, my wife went through hip replacement surgery, and she's grateful and I'm grateful. And I wear contacts, and I use a computer, and I didn't walk from Marshall to Abilene. And so our lives are immersed constantly in a technological environment. That's part of what makes any sort of discernment on these matters very, very difficult. One way of getting at the issue you've raised in some settings is what some want to distinguish as, on the one hand, therapy versus enhancement. And most would say, therapy, that's just, there you go. Why not? And I'm telling you, this CRISPR-Cas9, this is really developed since 2012, 2013. It does have remarkable promise for just dealing with, you remember that movie, I Am Legend, with Will Smith? You remember how it starts out, where the lady is kind of talking with a person in a white lab coat, that means she knows things, and she's asked, so you've cured cancer, haven't you? Well, yes, we have. Well, CRISPR-Cas9 is heading in that direction. Therapy, then enhancement. And it is a very difficult dividing line at some points. But all right, you spoke of prosthetics that are just remarkable advances in that area. Let me ask this. Say you were a physician, and someone who runs track comes to you and they have 2 healthy legs, but then they say, these new blades out there, they're just remarkable, and that's what I want. Can you remove my legs and put those on? Is that therapy or is that enhancement? Brent Waters does talk at length about that difficult dividing line, and he talks about dusk. We know it's not daylight, and we know it's not dark, and it's dusk. And sometimes the issues on therapy versus enhancement are more in that shadow time, and it's very difficult to discern. And to tell you the truth, that's kind of why I've wanted to do, I've kind of done this at two levels, on the technological aspects, but then underlying assumptions. I think those are matters we need to grapple with that would help on such concerns distinguishing therapy versus enhancement. What are our underlying assumptions about what it means to be a human being? Very, very important question there, certainly. Well, like that.